Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be revisiting a book that I've looked at several times previously, History of Political Philosophy. Every time I do an episode related to this book, I look at one specific essay about one specific political thinker. And the essay I'll be looking at today is about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That essay is written by Alan Bloom. The book here is the 1987 edition, the third edition. Was originally published in 1963. But this is the 87 edition. And this is a pretty good analysis of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, although I think that some of his political theory remains a little bit incomprehensible, maybe. I just think that Rousseau is wrong about a number of things, and that is reflected in his thought. It doesn't quite make sense because some of his foundational principles aren't correct. I think there's a bit of logical pretzel making in order to make it make sense, in order to come up with some sort of theory that makes sense when it's built on incorrect foundations. We'll look at that a little bit through the course of examining this essay. I've reviewed some of Rousseau's books in the past. Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which was one of his first, talked about this man in the state of nature and how he slowly came to a more civilized state, largely through the imposition of private property. And then last episode, I looked at Rousseau's Reveries of the Solitary Walker when he was older, and it's not really a political book. It's more about his reflections on life as an older man and looking back on his past. This episode is going to look more at his political theory. A lot of this is drawn from The Social Contract. And like I said, I think he's got a few mistakes. I think some of his mistakes relate to the state of nature. As I've said previously, a lot of these social contract theorists talk about a state of nature and talk about how from a state of nature, humans form these social contracts to establish a state. And there's kind of a process by which we come out of a state of nature and into a civilized state. And then there's a process by which we come out of sort of anarchy into a political arrangement with the government. And these aren't exactly the same processes. One of them is the concept really of coming from an animalistic way of being into human, rational, civilized way of being that is separate and different from the way the animals are, right? The inclusion of language and all the other things that go along with being a civilized human. And then the other one is really a discussion of how governments form. But, there's something to be said for the idea that these two go hand in hand, that upon becoming civilized, upon becoming something more than just animals, we form civilizations and we form societies and we form governments as a part of that process, and it's really one and the same. But this depends on there being a sort of, man before civilization or man before the state, a state of nature, mankind in a state of nature. These theorists were speaking before evolution, and so there was the idea that if you go back far enough in time, you find human beings that are living in a sort of a wild state. But now with evolution, we might say that as we became human, we acquired societies, and that process happened hand in hand, so that there really is no human without society. There is no human without some form of civilization. If you go back to a point where we are pre-civilized, or let's say, really pre-language, really early, you really are going back to a point that is pre-human. Now, I'm not sure how accurate that is, and I don't know if that's really pinned down, the origins of language, how much that differentiates from the origins of the human species, to what degree, like Neanderthals or Cro-Magnon or whatever, like the kind of pre-Homo sapien versions of humans, how much they had language, how much they had any form of societies or customs or anything, any sort of technologies. I don't think that's really pinned down to the point where we know exactly what that was like. But suffice to say that these social contract theorists and their theories about the state of nature, it's all very speculative. It's all very speculative. And so there may be some mistakes made in how they conceived humans. And I think that's going to come up in this episode a little bit. So like all my episodes, I'm going to read a few sections and have some comments. 6 sections in this episode that I want to read. Some are on the longer side. And I'm going to jump right in and read here when he talks about Rousseau and the ancient polis of ancient Greece, how he's looking back to the ancient Greek political theory, and he looks even further beyond that, and that's where he begins to look back to early man and back to the state of nature. He says, quote, "The first stage of Rousseau's reflection leads to admiration of the past. The situation of modern man is new, but in classical antiquity, models of civil society can be found in which men were free and governed themselves. The old republic, the polis, above all Sparta, was the refuge of real men and provided long periods of peace, stability, and independence. Rousseau revives the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns in restating the case for the ancient city. That city was not founded on comfort, self-preservation, or science, but on virtue, the science of simple souls. Virtue, in the classic sense, meant good citizenship, and the qualities that necessarily accompany it. Only on the basis of courage, self-sacrifice, and moderation can a city in which the great majority govern themselves be founded. Rousseau is a Republican. He is a Republican because he believes men are naturally free and equal. Only a civil society which is a reflection of that nature can hope to make men happy. The requirements of a free society were best met by the Greek cities and Rome, although they were not perfect, and Rousseau's ultimate solution is an improvement upon them. They were small, so that everyone could know everyone else and hence have both common interests and trust. They were governed by the people, so that the rulers and ruled were one and the same. There were thus no fundamental differences of interest between governors and governed. The laws were of ancient date, and men grew used to their heavy weight by force of long habit. The rule of law is necessary to civil society, and just laws require a stern moral code to support their burden equally. Only strict mutual surveillance and habits of justice can ensure their operation. The primary consideration of the government is the virtue of the citizens. The civil society, which is to function as a society, must be a unity, in which the individuals give up their private wishes for the sake of the whole. Society cannot be conceived of as the balance of conflicting interests, if men are to be free and not the pawns of interest groups in power. Not enlightenment, but severe moral education is the prerequisite of sound civil society. Rousseau's taste and his analysis of the injustice of modern society lead him back to Greece. But he is led even further. His teaching is not merely a revival of those of Plato and Aristotle. If he admires the practice of antiquity, he does not accept its theory. No political teaching can suffice which merely describes how to construct a stable order or how to make the citizens content. It must also legitimate the authority exercised by the government. It must state the grounds of the citizens' duties and rights. The central political question is always, what is justice? And this leads necessarily to the question, what is natural? For outside the limits of the positive law, when the problem is to found or reform a regime, The only standard can be nature, and more specifically the nature of man. And it is concerning this question that Rousseau differs from his predecessors, or rather, he joins the moderns in their denial that man is by nature political. Following the current of modern science in general, as well as of political science, Rousseau rejects the notion that man is directed by nature toward an end, the end of political life. The city or the state is a purely human construction, originating in the desire for self-preservation. As such, man is conceivable without political society, although in this later age it may have become necessary for him. Justice, as it can be seen in nations, consists in maintaining the privileges of those in positions of power. All known states are full of inequalities of birth, wealth, and honor. These inequalities can perhaps be justified in terms of the preservation of the regime, but that does not make them more tolerable for those who do not enjoy them. The laws institute and protect these differences of rank. If there are natural inequalities, those existing in the nation do not reflect them. They are the result of human deeds and of chance. They cannot be morally binding on those oppressed by their weight. If civil society is not natural, then one must go to a time prior to civil society to find man as he is naturally. This investigation is necessary in order to determine the origins of the state. If civil society is not natural, it is conventional. Therefore, if there is to be any legitimacy in the laws of civil society, its conventions must be founded on that first nature. Rousseau makes an attempt to describe man in the state of nature. Other modern thinkers who agreed that civil society is conventional tried to do the same thing, and to ground political right on a pre-political natural right. But according to Rousseau, they never succeeded in reaching the primitive state of nature. They were not radical enough in their own rejection of the naturalness of civil society. They denied that attachment to the common good and the political community are parts of human perfection, and they tried to derive the rules of politics from the individual unattached to any state. But they, in describing the individual, described in fact the man living in civil society. They were crypto-teleologists, in the sense that they tried to understand man as he is naturally from the point of view of his complete development in civil society. But if man is truly not a political and social being, then his nature must have been transformed in order for him ever to have come to the point where he could live in civil society. The earlier thinkers, in stripping man of his social nature, saw in him many characteristics which are results of communal living. For example, envy, distrust, unlimited desire for acquisition and reason. To know the natural man requires an almost superhuman effort of the mind, for we have no contact with him. We are civilized men, worn by the corrosion of civil society. End quote. All right, so what do we have in this rather early section? We have the introduction of the state of nature, and we have how Rousseau looked back to the ancient Greek city-state and its foundation in virtue, its focus on virtue. But he says he has to go back even before the early city-state. He says political teachings cannot suffice which describe merely how to construct a stable order or how to make the citizens content. Political teachings must legitimate the authority exercised by the government. It must state the grounds of the citizens' duties and rights. So this is interesting. Societies have to justify themselves, and this is an Enlightenment idea that everything must justify itself rationally. That you can't simply say, well, the society, we want to find the best society that's going to make people content, that's going to make people happy, that's going to make people prosperous. The society must be legitimate. It must legitimate itself. It must justify itself. And that's an interesting question. So the society has to answer for itself, and it doesn't just answer for itself in it is good for people. This particular society or that can bring people happiness. That alone doesn't legitimate it, because it has to be derived from duties and rights. It has to explain what the duties and rights are. It has to explain how it came about to be, and it legitimates itself through, largely in this social contract theory, through the consent of the people who originally founded the society, and all continuing people who participate in it by default provide their consent, and the state is only justified, it's only legitimate through this founding of the social contract. When in reality, the social contract is a very vague and kind of non-realistic premise. Societies are built largely on power and violence. People taking control over other people in order to force them into subservience is a part of it. People joining up for mutual defense from competitors is a part of it. There are a multitude of reasons that people will form societies. Part of it is mutual benefit, the benefits of mutual trade, the benefits of mutual defense, easy access to the resources that other persons can provide, the division of labor, various procreative marriage opportunities exist when, people are clustered in one place or they're operating as a group of people. There are a whole bunch of biological reasons and practical reasons, and they're not all always built on consent, and they're not built on agreement or any sort of social contract. So the need to legitimate, for society to legitimate itself, for political theory to craft a vision of society that justifies itself, is an interesting and I think possibly erroneous deviation from the classical political theory. And one line in here that I think is interesting, well, a couple of lines I want to go back and re-examine, where he says, outside the limits of the positive law, when the problem is to found or reform a regime, the only standard can be nature, and more specifically the nature of man. And it's concerning this question that Rousseau differs from his predecessors. He joins the moderns in their denial that man is by nature political. Following the current of modern science in general, as well as of political science, Rousseau rejects the notion that man is directed by nature toward an end, the end of political life. The city or the state is a purely human construction, originating in the desire for self-preservation. As such, man is conceivable without political society. So he's rejecting the idea that Aristotle put forward, and that has been an important part of a lot of political theory, that man is by nature political. Man is a political animal. Man is an animal that organizes himself into political units, into city-states, or into tribes, or into this or that thing, that he says, actually, that's not true. That is entirely a social construction. So we see here something that's similar to what I looked at in the Sophists, which is this conflict between physis and nomos, this conflict between what is natural and what is contrived, what is a social construction, what is custom. Nomos is custom, law, civilization, the state, all of the things that humans craft and create. That is all nomos. All of our institutions, all of our norms that vary from one group of people to another, those things are nomos, and then what is natural is physis. And so he sort of puts a conflict between these two, I think. He says that the city or the state is a purely human construction. He says Rousseau differs from his predecessors by denying that man is by nature political. And Rousseau basically says, and I think this is in another section that I wasn't going to read, but he basically says something along the lines of people are discontented, they're unhappy because they stand between nature and custom. And they have sort of one hand is grabbing hold of nature and the other hand is grabbing hold of custom, and men are torn between these two things. They're neither completely in nature, in which they could be happy. If they completely gave themselves over to nature, they could be happy. If they completely gave themselves over to custom, they could be happy. But because they're a little bit holding both of these things, they're sort of torn asunder by these conflicting forces, these conflicting drives, the drive of nature and the drives and the demands of custom and society, the way that it constrains your ability. You can't do completely whatever your instinct tells you to do. You're constrained, but you're not totally constrained. There's still a sense of your own desires and your own drives and your own wants and everything else. All the things that come up from you naturally, your sense of self, your pride, your everything else that is part of you naturally, that pulls you in one direction, and then big brother watching over you and making sure that you follow the rules all the time, that's pulling at you from the other direction. And so we're torn in between these things, and this is based on a conflict between physis and nomos, that these two things are not operating hand in hand. Now, if you were to say that man is a political animal, then you would say that it is natural for man to be in political life, that it's part of man's nature to be political, in which case then you find physis and nomos, you find nature and custom working more hand in hand with one another. And at that point, standing between nature and custom as a bridge between the two is man's natural place. And so he's not necessarily torn asunder, but it's the only place where he can be. It's the only place where he is in his natural state. Mankind is not in his natural state when he is living like an animal. We are not that sort of creature. And man is also not in his natural state when he completely gives himself over to the state, when he completely gives himself over to the law. That's not his natural state either. And it seems actually like mankind is not at his happiest when he's gone over to one or the other, but he's at his happiest when he is able to be a participant in a sort of harmonious synthesis of physis and nomos, when nature and custom can both express themselves through mankind, and he is a sort of a shepherd. He is a sort of steward of the synthesis between these two things. He crafts, he cooperates in the creation of the natural society, the natural polis, the natural tribe, or whatever it may be, the natural organization that he is drawn to. It can kind of it's a different way of looking at it. So the question of whether or not man is or is not a political animal is actually a very important one, because it kind of is the question of whether or not we should be in a state where we try to synthesize physis and nomos in our lives or not. And Rousseau's position is rather unique, that we're not political animals. So let me move on from there. He talks a little bit about how man moves from the natural state into a civilized state. And I talked about some of that stuff in the previous episode, The Origins of Inequality. So I want to jump here to where he begins to talk about the general will. And this is something that's more comes up in the social contract, and I haven't really spoken about this previously. So he says, quote, "Civil society cannot be grounded on natural right. Nature dictates only self-interest. Nature is too low to comprehend civil society. The study of nature leads to its rejection as the standard, at least for society. This is what Rousseau's predecessors had not understood, according to him. Civil society requires morality because man's natural character does not suffice to bind him to the more stringent demands of political life, and his newly inflamed passions make him even less fit for society. A society which was based on each man's calculation of his interests would only cause those passions to develop further, for his interest is already determined by his passions and would lead inevitably to tyranny or anarchy. Hence, since morality is not natural to man, he must create it. It is the basis for this project that Rousseau sets down in the social contract. In it, he tries to resolve the problem posed by the conflict between the individual and the state, or self-interest and duty. Nothing can bind man's freedom, but civil society is bondage. The act of establishing civil society is identical with that of establishing morality, or binding commitments to others. Since nature does not provide the basis for this agreement, it must be a convention. Traditionally, conventions were considered to be of a lower order than natural laws, precisely because they are man-made and changeable. Conventions differ everywhere and seem to be the result of arbitrary will and chance. The man who obeys convention would seem to be the prisoner of other men. But if man is free, his capacity to make conventions is the sign of that freedom. His will is not limited by nature. To this extent, man, the maker of morality and the state, is the fulfillment of the notion of man as the free, undetermined being. If the simply arbitrary character of conventions could be avoided, then one could say that a conventional civil society is at once the fulfillment of man's nature and worthy of his respect and obedience. As Rousseau puts it in his own forceful formulations, the difficulty is to find a form of association which defends and protects with all the common force the person and the goods of each associate, by which each, uniting himself to all, obeys nevertheless only himself and remains as free as before. The solution is that every man give himself entirely to the community, with all of his rights and property. The deposit is made with the whole, with no individual. In this way, no one puts himself in the hands of another. The contract is equal, for each gives all. No one reserves any rights by which he can claim to judge of his own conduct. Hence there is no source of conflict between individual and state, for the individual has contracted to accept the law as the absolute standard for his acts. The social contract forms an artificial person, the state, which has a will like the natural person. What appears necessary or desirable to that person is willed by it, and what is willed by the whole is law. Law is the product of the general will. Each individual participates in legislation, but law is general, and the individual, in his role as legislator, must make laws which can conceivably be applied to all members of the community. He makes his will into law, but now, as opposed to what he did in the state of nature, he must generalize his will. As legislator, he can only will what all could will. As citizen, he obeys what he himself willed as legislator. Although men of diverse tastes and understandings go to make up the sovereign legislative body, none can impose his will on the others unless the others could have willed it themselves. The law is produced by the will of each thinking in terms of all. The primary function of the social contract is to constitute a regime which can express the general will." End quote. So here's where it starts to get, in my opinion, a little bit nonsensical when we start talking about the general will. Now, as a rough concept, you could say, well, the general will is like the will of the people, what the people want to do. If the people wish this, if the people wish that, if the people vote in favor of one course or another course, then that is representative of the general will. But there's a sort of strange totalitarian aspect to it all. I think he really advocates that in order to kind of square the circle of how people, how to avoid like the conflict between the will of the individual person and like the will of the state or the will of the government or the will of society, he essentially postulates that as a result of the social contract, each person has completely given up his individual will to have any sort of ability to judge his own conduct. But because every single person has made the same commitment that they give completely over their judgment to the whole, to the general will, that no person has given himself over to someone else, because no one has retained their individual will. No one is really like in control, but everyone is in control together. And everybody makes this agreement to completely give up their own will in favor of the individual will. But that doesn't seem entirely possible. It doesn't seem necessarily like people would really enjoy it without some sort of a deep propaganda or brainwashing of some sort, in order for people to really like feel that the general will is their own will and their own will is the general will. These two things sort of are synonymous with one another simply because they have at some point in the past agreed to participate in society. I think it makes a demand on people's willingness to be completely absorbed into the state as a result of their social contract participation. which seems like kind of unnatural, but again, he's not really advocating for naturalness. So in that section, there was one part here where I wanted to revisit, which is where he says, traditionally, conventions were considered to be of a lower order than natural laws, precisely because they're man-made and changeable. Conventions differ everywhere and seem to be the result of arbitrary will and chance. The man who obeys convention would seem to be the prisoner of other men. So this is the age-old conflict between convention and nature, between physis and nomos, and it does recall, I think, Antigone, where the king had this old Greek play where the king had, I believe, demanded that this person's body remain unburied, and his sister goes ahead and secretly buries the body, and now she's kind of at trial, and she says, well, although king, your law says to nobody's allowed to bury this body, there's a greater law even than yours. There's another law that is more important than your law, and that is the law of the gods. And that's sort of like the natural law that people should look after their kin. So when she goes to bury the body of her brother, she's commanded to do that by the laws of nature. That her bond to her brother, her affection for her brother, is more valid, more powerful than the law and the dictates of the king. And so I think that was oftentimes an idea that comes through in philosophy as well, that custom and convention are just sort of lesser laws, and there are deeper, more profound, more fundamental laws of reality that are primordial and have greater demand, make greater and more lasting demands of people than convention, because one people might have one set of rules and one people might have another set of rules, but this natural law is universal, and so it's more important. But Rousseau says, actually, if man is free, then his capacity to make conventions is a sign of his freedom. His will is not limited by nature. To this extent, man, the maker of morality and the state, is the fulfillment of the notion of man as the free, undetermined being. So man as a free being is free to transcend the laws of nature and create convention. Now he says if you were to somehow avoid the arbitrary nature of convention and just look at convention as such, you could say that the creation of convention is the fulfillment of man's nature as a free being. And so here's another of the errors, I think, that comes about in Rousseau and comes about in a lot of these other Enlightenment thinkers, that just assume that man's nature is free. And this is where it becomes sort of nonsensical again. If man's nature is totally free, then man is completely free and undetermined, a free, undetermined being, and the conventional civil society is at once the fulfillment of man's nature and worthy of his respect and obedience. It is the pinnacle of mankind to, as a free being, to transcend nature and create convention and custom. But it's not because man is a political animal by nature. It's not that convention is a part of man's nature. It's that man has a nature of pure freedom. And it's that pure freedom that enables man to transcend nature, to escape from nature, to be free from nature's law, and craft society. So this, I think, is where I think a lot of the mistake comes from, that society isn't formed because man has this radical freedom that allows him to escape from nature, although that might be some component of it. It's also like man is a political animal, and being in a society and crafting laws and having languages is part of man's nature, and he's not transcending nature by doing so. He's conforming to nature by doing so, which is different. So moving on from there, he talks a little bit about sovereignty and radical democracy. And he's trying to pin down what the general will is, how the general will is determined, how the general will is sovereign over the will of any of the people. And again, I think because he's arguing from flawed premises, he determines some flawed results, some results that don't make a tremendous... I mean, not that it doesn't make sense, but it just doesn't hold up. It's to scrutiny. It's just not... These aren't accurate statements, I don't think, about the best way for society to operate. So he says, quote, "The social contract constitutes the sovereign." Rousseau uses the term sovereign to indicate that the source of all legitimacy is in the people at large, as opposed to the monarch or the aristocrats or any other segment. There must be a government, and it may be monarchic, aristocratic, or democratic, but its right to rule is derived from the people and exercised only so long as it pleases them. Since nature and revealed religion have been set aside, only the voice of the people can establish law. Every enactment must return to them, to their will. The will of the people is the only law. The government is obedient to the law alone, and every citizen is constantly a member of the lawmaking body. Every citizen finds himself in a double relation to the state, as a lawgiver insofar as he is a member of the sovereign, and as a subject of the law, an individual who must obey. Several consequences follow from the fact that the sovereign is the only source of legitimacy. In the first place, sovereignty is inalienable. No man or group of men can be given the right to make laws in the place of the citizen body at large. They would be acting according to their individual wills, and their enactments would not be binding. This means that representative government is a bad form of government. Others take the responsibility from the citizens, and they lose their citizen virtues as well as their freedom. If a nation is so large that the citizens cannot hope to meet in a common body, then representation becomes an unfortunate necessity, a necessity which weakens the expression of the general will. If any legitimacy is to be preserved in such a case, the representatives must be elected by local assemblies in which all citizens meet, and the representatives must be given complete instructions. They must have no independent judgment, and for every new question which arises, they must return to those who elected them. Otherwise, there is no general will. The general will requires constant consultation. It can be consulted only by vote, so that the system suggested by Rousseau turns out to be majoritarian, but it is not a simple majoritarianism. The laws can only be properly instituted if the citizens possess the virtue to suppress their private wills. The individuals must be citizens in the classical sense, and this requires a very severe, self-imposed morality. Rousseau is not a libertarian in the modern sense of the word. Every man cannot live as he likes, for that would end the possibility of agreement and destroy the sources of the moral energy necessary to self-control. Rousseau despised democracy as it is usually practiced because it means a wild anarchy of self-interest. A formalistic insistence on the vote of the people is meaningless without the establishment of its moral preconditions. Sparta was right in its concentration on the habits of the citizens as over against the modern laxity which leaves the private life to the individuals. The tastes and manners of the citizens affect all their judgments, and certain habits make free government altogether impossible. Rousseau reestablishes the Greek city but brings to light the true principle which motivated its insistence on austere virtue. Virtue is not itself the end, it is a means to freedom. End quote. So, I'm not so sure that this really adds up. He's really looking for absolute democracy, in the sense that there is no representation, or as minimal amount of representation. Representative government is not legitimate because the people who are elected can't have any decision-making power of their own. Even if they're elected and the citizens sort of grant them decision-making power because of their character or their ethics or whatever, their platform, that's not really legitimate. It has to be that the representatives get every instruction from the people that they're representing, and that's it. They don't have any decision-making. So it's basically like majoritarian, he says, but not really majoritarian because the people can't just be all voting according to, a million different private individual wills. people have to suppress their individual will, and they have to be voting for what is best for the nation or the society, and not what is in their own interest. It's not a set of competing interests where one group of people wants this and another group of people wants that, because in order to truly have the social contract be like the legitimate source of society, all the people in it have to completely abandon their particular interests and only vote for the interests of the society. And so there's a virtue that has to be inculcated in people in order for this like radical democracy to be functional and legitimate. So none of that stuff seems particularly realistic. People aren't going to just completely give over their individual wills to society to only what their closest approximation of what they think the general will ought to be, what they think is best for the society as a whole. Expecting that people are going to make those sorts of votes is unrealistic, and so there has to be this like regime of imposition of morality, in order for this system to work. It almost starts to verge on police state, where people's votes are maybe not, you're only allowed to vote one way, but the and that's not to say that societies shouldn't have any part in like trying to steer or craft or guide the virtues of the participants of society, but I think most of us kind of feel as if people ought to be able to vote for what is best for them and their family and their kin and the people that they care about and the interests that they have, their ideological desires, whatever it may be. We have a world now where you can really vote for whatever you want, whatever kind of system you want. You're considering what's best for the nation in your vote, but also you're considering what's best for you and what's best for your interests. And I'm not sure that's well. Again, if you feel that people must be completely either totally given over to nature in order to be happy, or totally given over to custom in order to be happy, and that standing halfway between the two is a state of misery, then Rousseau is really saying that, well, we can't really go back to being in a complete state of nature. We're too far gone. We're past that point, and we have to make the full leap. We have to make the complete transformation into people who are totally given over to the state, people who are totally dependent mentally on the customs, who are guided by the customs and are thinking only in terms of what is in the best interests of the society as a whole. But I think for me and for many people that doesn't sound like happiness at all. So he's asking for something and proposing it as a sort of happiness that most people think that doesn't sound very appealing. And he also talks about how this is sort of a freedom. This virtue is not an end in itself, but it's a means to freedom. And this is a sort of like you acquire your freedom when you completely give up your ego and your self-interest and you're completely dedicated to the interests of the society. You acquire a sort of freedom that way. And again, that rubs people, I think, the wrong way because it doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems like something contrived in order to continue making the logical sequence that's based on the erroneous foundations. Most people don't really see completely giving yourself over to the society as a whole as freedom. That the society, it's really, you're asking people to become like insects, where the society is free, right? The society is free from the drives of its constituent members. The society acts in its own accord without any natural constraints placed upon it by the natural inclinations of its constituent members. And so long as people completely identify their own will with the general will of society unconstrained by any individual, then that's the sort of freedom that Rousseau is talking about. But people aren't insects, and they're not going to consider that happiness, and they're not going to consider that freedom. So he talks some more here about factions and the institutions of society. And he says, quote, "In addition to virtue, the expression of the general will must be guaranteed by the suppression of faction. Each citizen alone cannot hope to have his private will prevail, and recognizes that if everyone voted according to his passions, there would be no order. It is only when he belongs to a group large enough to influence the vote decisively that his private will overcomes his sense of the general will in seeing what he personally can gain. Thus, parties must be forbidden, and extremes of wealth and poverty must be prevented. Insofar as possible, informed citizens must vote as individuals, and the result of such a vote can be considered a general will." Rousseau was aware of the tension that exists between the stability that law requires and the constant reconsideration implied in the assembly of the people. There is no law or institution which cannot be revoked if the state is going to be governed by the actual wills of its present citizens. Every assembly must begin with the question, does the sovereign please to preserve the present form of government? But the idea that the law is a product of one's will weakens the almost religious awe that is necessary to maintain the respect for law. Old institutions and the sacredness of the law are restraints on the expression of selfish interest. The man who never conceives of the possibility of altering the established way is more likely to behave according to the commands he never questioned than the one who is accustomed to easy change. This is a difficulty never entirely resolved by Rousseau, but which he attempts to do away with by making the process of change difficult, by making the individuals who suggest it responsible for its effects, and by an education in the respect for good institutions. But the possibility of change cannot be obviated if the citizens are to be conscious of their freedom and able to judge what preserves it and what destroys it. The sovereign is, by its nature, also indivisible. The notion of the general will makes it impossible for there to be a separation of powers, which is anything more than a delegation for the execution of functions previously defined by the sovereign and ultimately dependent upon it. The sovereign power is a unity, which cannot be divided without destroying it. No authority is anything but derivative from it. End quote. So he's arguing here against any sort of faction, against any sort of balance of powers, checks and balances, parties, all these things. They split the sovereign into competing portions. And instead of having a general will, you have a multitude of smaller wills, perhaps a multitude of smaller general wills comprised of the general will that is expressed by each particular faction in competing with one another. And so society doesn't have a general will. It's just each faction is out for its own interests. And so to truly express the general will in this pure democracy, factions must be outlawed or restricted. There cannot be, forbidden. He says parties must be forbidden. And also extremes of wealth and poverty must be prevented. And this is to prevent people from being too wrapped up in their own interests or having too much power in society to enact their will. If someone doesn't have enough, their self-interest becomes more important. They need to get more because they feel deprived. If someone has a lot, then they gain more sway over the society than they ought to have in order for the general will to be truly representative. So, it seems somewhat like, and you could probably guess, it seems a little bit like communism, in the sense that the way every single person is not allowed to have any sort of outsized influence. There's a real strong leveling, and in order for this general will to be the most generalized and for each person to have an totally equal say in the direction of the general will, would require equality of resources. Everybody, just a very equalizing process has to overcome society. There can't be these hierarchies. There can't be people who have more power or who have less power. This all boils down to the fact that this is, in Rousseau's argument, a total social construction and has no real basis in human nature. That's why it seems so alien to us. Like, human nature is more hierarchical. Human nature is that some people are more powerful and some people are less powerful, and the more powerful people will acquire more authority and more power as a result of their skills, their intelligence, whatever it may be. Nature is hierarchical, and so this general will is not a natural phenomenon. It's like the ultimate social construction. So, moving on to, he discusses the variety of potential regimes, and he says, quote, "Although the formal conditions of legitimacy are the same everywhere, Rousseau wanted to preserve a realm for the activity of statesmanship. He knew that politics could not be made an abstract science, as some modern theory wanted it to be. He tried to combine the clarity and certainty of modern political science with the flexibility of the classical art of politics. The fact of differences of circumstance means that many nations cannot enjoy liberty, and that many others can only have a diluted form of it. A regime that could be realized everywhere would be of such a low order that the few who can enjoy a good one would be deprived of it without the others gaining by it. Legislation must be made at the right moment, and a primitive people uncorrupted by decadent habits is most eligible for it. The climate and the territory, its extent and character must be taken into consideration. The traditions of the people and their manners determine the range of possibilities. The fact that the general will is formal allows for these differences. There is no doctrine of natural law which limits the statesman's activities and forces him to mitigate his judgments about what most conduces to the common good. That there are different peoples implies that the determinations of the general will differ. The diversity of life is preserved, but man is not left without moral guidance. In the diversity there is the unity which is everywhere the same, the general will. But there are no universal substantive commands implied in the general will. A great variety of opposed principles can legitimately be emitted by it. It can make laws which lead to widely varying styles of life and action. According to the social contract and the political philosophy underlying it, there is no one best regime or scheme of laws. Different arrangements can equally well allow for the existence of a general will in different circumstances." End quote. So this part here, I think, in some way undoes much of what he's saying, in the sense that he recognizes that two societies, each of which is expressing its own general will, may very well look different, because the general will of one society is going to manifest in one way and is going to point in one direction. The general will of another society points in a different direction. And so long as each one is expressing the general will in its own way, it's going to craft itself to look different. The people, one set of people will advocate for one thing, and another set of people will advocate for another. But because of the division between society and custom and nature, there remains no distinguishing principle that determines what a society even is. If there are multiple societies and each one has its own general will, what is that society? And what would be the reason why it's not more preferable for all of humanity to be a part of one global government to achieve the ultimate general will of the human species? What reason would there be not to do that? And I don't think Rousseau can offer any reason why we wouldn't do that. Just like this society, left to its own devices, will have this general will. That society, left to its own devices, will have a different general will and point in a different direction. The same thing can be said of factions. If you have a society with factions, one faction is going to have a general will that points one way. Another faction has a general will that points another way. Let's say these factions are geographical. Let's say you have the United States of America. One faction is one part of the country. One faction is another part of the country. And are these different factions with different interests, and they're going to compete against one another, and that's going to damage the general will, that's going to constrain or impair the general will of the nation as a whole because it's riven by faction? But why wouldn't it just split in that case into smaller nations, each one with its own general will? But in those smaller nations, there would be, again, factions, urban factions, rural factions, And why should they all be constrained to achieve one singular general will? Why wouldn't the whole thing break down until such a point where it doesn't naturally tend toward further stratification? Why wouldn't it expand to encompass the whole globe if different factions must reconcile their differences and give themselves over to what is best for the larger group? Why wouldn't different nations be just considered different factions of the human race, and all nations would be obligated to submit their own factional interests to the interests of the human species? There's no real reason for the existence of the nation state at any particular level in my understanding of Rousseau. And again, that's because of his fundamental premise, his two fundamental premises, that man is naturally free and so is not constrained by nature, and that man is not a political animal. But if you say that man is a political animal and man is not free because he is constrained by nature, he is constrained by the circumstances of his birth, the people that he surrounds himself with, the people that he's born, the society he's born into, then you begin to argue for an organic society, an organic nation state, and the nation as an idea, or the nation as a representation of a general will divorced from nature, is a fundamentally different sense of a nation versus the sense of a nation as an organic entity that has a natural bond, and that bond may be partly geographic, partly cultural, and partly ethnic, that forms bonds of loyalty between the members of the nation that they don't share with members of other nations on account of these natural divisions. And so there's a sort of natural formation of nations and peoples, and the existence of this society and that society, and the fact that they are not two parts of one society, is a natural phenomenon. And so I think that that's really a big part of where Rousseau goes wrong, and where the whole like attempt to make nationhood a social contract, a consensual agreement, an expression of a general will, an abstract idea. All these things are incorrect conceptions of nationhood. Nations are organic entities that we don't consent to participation in, and we don't form, but are formed naturally by our environment and by the human condition. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I've covered the basics here. Obviously, there's more to this essay that I haven't discussed, but that should do for now. We've got a bit of an insight into Rousseau's social contract and some of what I think are the problems of his political philosophy. There's value in it. There's value in analyzing all of these Enlightenment thinkers, but there are some core problems with Enlightenment thinking. Rousseau is one of those folks who's kind of like Edmund Burke, but maybe in a different direction. Rousseau has a little bit of the Enlightenment side to his thinking, but in another sense, he could be considered one of the first counter-Enlightenment thinkers because of some of the ways that he anticipated Romanticism. But I'm not going to get into that right now. That maybe came across a little bit in the last episode. So I guess I'll call it quits here, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.